HYROX is fitness racing. CrossFit is a sport of fitness. Both use functional movements performed at high intensity, combining aspects of strength and endurance. This naturally makes them quite similar. However, different types of athletes tend to excel in the top competitions of each sport. In this video, I will dive into the differences between HYROX and CrossFit. Not from a technical point of view, but rather from a physiological and nutritional perspective. If you are an athlete considering trying HYROX, but you're not certain if this is the right fit for you, this is a video you don't want to miss. Let's dig into it. Hi everyone, I'm Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied the interaction between exercise and nutrients and how they affect muscle growth. But lately, I've been more and more involved in functional fitness and the research behind CrossFit and also HYROX. So what would be the obvious differences between HYROX and CrossFit? Most of the people who follow this channel know CrossFit, but HYROX is a little bit less known. It has been founded in Germany in 2017 and it's obviously a derivative of CrossFit, but there are some key differences. For example, the duration of the events in HYROX are usually much longer than CrossFit. That's a key difference here, ranging from 60 to 90 minutes, a little bit depending on your level. So the major focus in HYROX would be conditioning. Compared to CrossFit, I will get into that later in this video, would be more power output, short burst of energy production. Then the predictability. Obviously, we all know in HYROX exactly the workout that will be put forward to us. So the high predictability is a major difference, I would say, also between HYROX and CrossFit, because CrossFit is known for known and unknowable. Most people, athletes, sometimes don't know the workouts when they are warming up for a workout, for example, in the games or semifinals also here. We don't know much about the workouts. The level of skill I have put here low for HYROX. Obviously, it's not low, but it's clearly lower for HYROX than for CrossFit. CrossFit has these gymnastic movements or weightlifting movements that for normal people would not be something that is very obvious. And then I will also get into that HYROX is attracting taller athletes because the movements are biomechanically more made for taller athletes. For CrossFit, it is a little bit shifting, certainly in the games and the semifinals, so at the later stages of elite competition. But when you have CrossFit workouts that have been or that are predominantly done in the gym, like burpees, snatches, most of those movements are, let's say, predominantly positive for smaller athletes. These are some more obvious differences. So let's look at how we can then understand these differences from a more physiological point of view and how we can then adapt our training as well as our nutrition to HYROX or to CrossFit. So if you want to move your muscles, move your body, the muscles need ATP. And this ATP can be looked at as the energy currency of the body. This means that it can never deplete or go down to zero. It always has to be replenished by the energy systems listed here on the slide. So you have different types of energy systems. We're not going to go too much into detail. Most importantly is that you have very powerful energy systems such as a creatine phosphate system and the alactic glycolytic system. So here you produce energy via anaerobic without oxygen pathways, and then you also have the more, let's say, aerobic pathways where you break down glucose, such as aerobic glycolysis pathway, and then also we all know the fat oxidation or the fat adaptation pathway. All right, so the higher the intensity, the more you have to look at the left side of the curve, and the lower the intensity and the longer the duration, the more you have to look at the right side of the curve. And then it's very obvious that CrossFit is more sitting on the left side of the curve with their workouts from 3 seconds, which is obviously very alactic creatine phosphate system, for example, a muscle up or a 1RM deadlift, but then also 10-minute workout where you're really sitting into this glycolysis metabolic pathways. But then you also obviously have HYROX, and HYROX is much more conditioning to the right side of this graph, where you have always, let's say, depending a little bit on the athlete, more of a mix between a fat oxidation as well as glucose oxidation. So that's something that is very basic from a physiology point of view. But what are the implications? So I tested not so long ago a couple of elite CrossFit athletes. I'm talking about semi-final level, games level. And what was interesting to me is that their aerobic base, so their basic conditioning, is actually not that high. So you see here the lactate curve. If the athlete would have a bigger base, the lactate would be shifted more to the right. That makes sense, right? Because lactate obviously is produced by anaerobic systems, and when the athlete has to tap in their anaerobic system from the early intervals, obviously lactate would be, or lactate production would go up a little bit, and you would see that in the lactate curve. So I never tested HYROX athletes, but something you can look for as a coach or also an athlete is that the curve would be shifted much more to the right, and also exponentially would not go up to very high lactate levels. That is something I always found quite interesting, I have to say, is that this aerobic base in CrossFit athletes, also the best in the world, is not very high. So why is the body adapted this way? So then we have to look at a little bit of data. Here they did a very cool study. So they did Fran, the workout Fran, 21, 15, 9 thrusters and pull-ups, but they just didn't do them continuously. They always let the athletes rest between the 21 rounds, the 15 rounds and the 9 rounds. So it was an intermittent Fran. And then they measured oxygen uptake and also the contribution of the aerobic versus the anaerobic systems. And here the black bars, the big black bars you see also on the right, are the contribution of the aerobic system in the first round. So 21 thrusters, 21 pull-ups, and then the gray is the lactic production of the anaerobic system, and then the 30% here, light gray, is the anaerobic system where there's no lactate production, so that's a creatine phosphate system. And you see here that the first round is more, or predominantly, let's say 50-50 aerobic anaerobically, but when the rounds become shorter and shorter, there's more contribution of the anaerobic systems. So this means that actually the anaerobic system is highly important in CrossFit specific exercises, and that's maybe also why we see such high lactate and maybe a low aerobic base in many of the CrossFit athletes. Interestingly enough, in another study, the same authors, the same group, did also Fran, but continuously, so 21, 21, 15, 15, 9, 9, and there you already see a larger contribution, so 62% of all the energy was produced from aerobic sources and only 38% would be from anaerobic sources. While when you do this intermittently, so with rest, there's a higher contribution of anaerobic sources. And that's also something I always find myself. If I do CrossFit, I'm much better in, let's say, interval type workouts, like team workouts, because I'm a more anaerobic based athlete, or average Joe, I would call it rather. But that is interesting, right? Because this means that if there is some rest, I can always go hard, anaerobic energy production, and then have to throttle down. But once there is a workout that is like 10, 20, 15 minutes long with all types of different exercises, I usually do bad because I also have a low aerobic base and I should improve my conditioning here. So that is something you can always think about. Then as a third aspect of a difference between HYROX and CrossFit would be the type of athlete. So we did a study. I talked about this in a previous video where I talked about the difference in VO2 max, or why athletes or CrossFit athletes have a low VO2 max. It's popping up right here. If you're interested in this video, it's quite a good one. But we did a study where we profiled 60 very well-trained and even elite world-class CrossFit athletes. And what we immediately saw here is that they were, obviously this is just the men, they were not very tall, 176 centimeters. But what was more interesting is that there was a strong correlation between the length of the arm or the length of the thigh and their open rank. For example, here, 28% of the variance in open rank, so how well they did in the open style workouts, was determined by their core length as well as their arm length, etc., which was highly significant. Obviously, the smaller the length or the shorter the length, the better they performed in the open. So in open style workouts, it's clearly a benefit to be small. So I looked at HYROX. Obviously, there's no real scientific research yet in HYROX. At least I didn't find any. If you did, please let me know in the comment section. So I just looked at how tall the top 10 athletes, male athletes that have the best times in the pro division. And you see here, they are substantially taller. They're 5.5 centimeter on average taller than the CrossFit athlete, which is quite a lot, I would say. So for example, here Hunter McIntyre is 1 meter 88, and most of them are above or around 1 meter 80. That makes sense, right? Because you have sled pushes, you have wall balls, you have lunges, all movements, you have rowing, you have running, literally all movements that are better biomechanically for taller athletes compared to burpees, snatches, pull-ups, etc. for CrossFit athletes, which obviously are more for smaller athletes. One caveat here, maybe if you have followed the CrossFit semifinals that were just the last couple of weeks, you see that actually there, taller athletes do well. Jelle Hoste, Jason Hopper, Dallin Pepper, all these guys, they actually did very well in those CrossFit style workouts because in the semifinals and also at the games, the programming is more tailored to taller, at least more powerful athletes with a lot of muscle mass and a lot of energy production on a short time frame. So that's something to take into account. All right, so talk about training. So how should you then train for CrossFit compared to HYROX? There would be obviously some similarities, but also some differences. As we know, HYROX, you can structure your training much better. You can do interval sets, you can do movement, you can use the movements that we know are going to pop up in the workout and combine this in intervals or EMOMs or AMRAPs of longer duration. With CrossFit, it's more difficult. You don't know what's going to happen, so you have to train everything. It's going to be more random. There's going to be more interference between strength and endurance. And that's why, yeah, it's just a different type of training, random versus structured. HYROX, you can do long intervals, clearly. For example, 5 times 8 minutes, 4 times 5 minutes with a bit of rest. CrossFit, I would go for shorter intervals, high burst of energy output, and then rest longer times, because that is exactly what you need, this anaerobic energy output from CrossFit, at least a large percentage of the workouts. Then, if you want to look at it from a more physiological point of view, HYROX, they will need a large aerobic base. So a lot of the energy production need to come from aerobic energy sources, and that you can improve by long intervals, but also zone 2 training. Zone 2, you've heard about that maybe a lot. It is very low intensity, long training sessions. For example, 75% of your functional threshold power for 45 minutes. So sitting on an erg, going very slow for 45 minutes. In CrossFit, it's less of an issue because again, it's more anaerobic energy production. But I would say most of the CrossFit athletes train in this zone 4 and 5 instead of the zone 2. Except if you are really, really bad in conditioning, you can also incorporate some zone 2 in CrossFit, in my opinion. And then HYROX is less technical, you know the movements, so you can really nail down your movement efficiency on the sled push, on the more technical movements such as wall balls and the lunges. While in CrossFit, you have to be technical in every aspect of gymnastics and weightlifting, which obviously makes the programming and the whole training plan much more challenging. Let's go to the last part. That would be nutrition. So nutrition is also, again, a derivative on how long the workouts are. In HYROX, we are talking about 60 to 90 minutes. So then you are really tapping into your glycogen reserves. Glycogen is basically stored glucose in your liver and your muscles. You need to have those as fuel. And if you, at the end of a HYROX, so after 60, 70, 80 minutes, are low in glycogen, you will have to throttle down and actually decrease your power output. All right. So it is recommended to actually have some carbohydrates in HYROX during the competition because the workouts are longer than 45 to 60 minutes. And depending on the athlete and how well your gut is trained, you can go up to 60 to 90 grams of combination of glucose or maltodextrin and fructose. In CrossFit, obviously, you cannot eat during a 10-minute workout. So there, the nutrition will be much more structured around and before your training, because obviously you can also do a lot of volume in CrossFit training, 2, 3, 4 sessions a day, all right? That doesn't mean that you don't have to eat the carbs, but you just cannot eat them during the training. And that's an important, I would say, difference. All right, that was already it for today's video. I hope you liked the content. If you are interested in some tips on CrossFit specific programming, just click the video right here.